Hello, everyone. This panel is about anti Semitism and anti Israeli discourse that perhaps is even borders on anti Semitism, and we'll soon talk about. Yes, you need headsets. That's the rules of the genre here. If you don't have headphones, then you won't be able to hear. This panel is about anti Semitism and anti Israeli discourse that borders on anti Semitism, and we'll soon understand what this means in radical circles or perhaps extreme progressive circles in the US and in Europe. And in recent years, we've been hearing a lot about these things. So let me first introduce the speakers, then I'll start with a few introductory comments, and then I'll ask the distinguished panelists to give a certain kind of opening, perhaps a 3 minute opening, their opinion about this topic, their experience with this subject, and then we'll continue. And we have a distinguished panel ahead of us. Former Knesset member Ayelet Nachmias Verbing. She's the chair of J-Ready of the Jewish Agency. Shirley Mizrahi, who's a returning Shilicha from Amitei Israel at Ohio University, the head of business collaboration and development and the lead organization, Dr. Einat Wilf, a former Knesset member and an author, and of course Dani Dayan, who's the chair of Yad Vashem, the most central memorial organization in Israel and in the world for the Holocaust, formerly General Consul of Israel in New York and formerly chair of the Judea and Samaria Council. And before I address all of you, let's perhaps set the framework of this conversation according to a series of reports published by the ADL and other organizations. There's a continuous increase in incidents and statements, anti-Semitic statements and expressions of occurrences of anti Semitism in college campuses. Sometimes these comments are made under the guise or the umbrella of Palestinian rights and thus completely rule out the right of Jews to have a country. More or less, this is what we're going to be talking about. Comments or calls such as "from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," and these statements are perceived by Jewish communities in the U.S. as genocidal or anti-Semitic, and we can discuss whether that's what it is. Reports by Hillel as well as the ADL that show that Jewish students in universities often wish to conceal their Jewish identity because they are afraid that if they will be identified as supporters of Israel, one of the things that's most archetypically anti-Semitic, as if all Jews have this beehive consciousness, they all work in coordination and in collaboration, and if there's a state of Israel, they all work for it. It's the classic perception of anti-Semitism. And following Operation Guarding of the Walls here in Israel, the ADL documented in a great number of extreme anti-Semitic occurrences and statements. If you remember, there was one occasion in which a Jew was actually attacked at the background of this campaign. I would like to say, because I don't see another panel from the other side, that except for this kind of anti-Semitism, the physical, tangible, immediate risk to Jewish communities in the U.S., the ones for which many Jews have been murdered in recent years, for example, the attack on the synagogue in Pennsylvania, as well as in other places, that risk is the risk from the extreme right, white supremacist anti-Semitism, which is violent anti-Semitism, but it is not part of the circles of the American elite. And these are the circles we're talking about in this conversation. That anti-Semitism is part of the far right, sometimes part of the far right, far Christian right, but not always. And as far as the safety to Jewish communities and the reason why there are buzzers at the entrance, it's the risk of Islamist anti-Semitism and terror. and the risk from extreme right wing anti Semitism, and not the kind of anti Semitism we're going to talk about here. First of all, I'd like to ask the speakers, maybe we can start with from right to left, from Danny to me. I'd like to ask you, to what extent does Israel, because everybody sitting on this stage are Israelis, to what extent is Israel placing Jews in the US and in Europe in an impossible situation in a certain respect? On the one hand, it wants their support. It wants all Jews to identify with Israel. It's really working hard to achieve that. And until Jews are accused by its sins, quote unquote, quote unquote, the sins of Israel, as well as the Jewish community supporting it, are saying that it's anti-Semitism. So they're in a bit of an impossible situation. And I'd like to ask you, where are we at today? After several years of activities by the ADL and other organizations, in what situation are we at today with this new anti-Semitism that definitely exists in this radical sphere? Look, I don't think that it's Israel's fault. I think this term you used is not exactly accurate. I think Israel can be blamed of something else, and maybe it's not the topic of this panel, but what Israel can be accused of is indifference towards Jews in the world. I think Israel is indifferent towards world Jewry. It takes an interest in them, let's say, only when they get murdered, only when it harms its own interests, and it takes less of an interest in the lives of Jews all over the world. But I think that perhaps we need to give a bit of a broader perspective to this phenomena you're talking about. You know, when I came to New York in August of 2016, I thought that anti-Semitism will be somewhere lower on my agenda, and then I was quite astonished to discover that it started slowly. It started with desecrating cemeteries, and then swastikas, and then in Charlottesville, where we saw Jews will not replace us, Nazi flags at the center of an American city. And of course, it reached its peak in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, with a massacre of 11 Jews who were praying in their synagogue. But I think what we have is four types of anti Semitism in the U.S., and there is a certain synergy between them, even though some are from the extreme left and some from the extreme right. The first one is classic anti Semitism, naked, crude, neo Nazi anti Semitism that to a great extent we saw it in Pittsburgh. There it had to do with immigrants, but that's a classic anti-Semitism, definitely in Charlottesville. A different type of anti-Semitism that has become lethal, and we've seen it in the headlines in recent days. That's Afro-American ideological anti-Semitism. This is a phenomena that we didn't really know in the past. It was mainly represented over the years by Louis Farrakhan. And over the past few days, Kanye West has taken his place. The third type of anti-Semitism, which is very popular but is less lethal at this stage, it's what I call thugs anti-Semitism, without any ideology between the. But let's say a woman with a head cover or a wig passes by and they pull on it, or they shatter the window seal of a store, front window of a store with a Jewish name. And another type of anti Semitism that so far did not lead to any murders in the US is that anti Semitism that guises itself as anti Zionism, but in the long run, I think we all understand that its implications could be much more severe than all the other types together. And another source of concern is that there is a certain interaction between all these types of anti-Semitism that create a certain phenomena that's become quite intolerable. Well, over the past year, I was a visiting professor at Georgetown, and I taught a course on Zionism and anti-Zionism. And at the end of the course, one of the Jewish students came up to me and she said that this course was so much more valuable to her than dozens of hours in therapy. That helped me understand that anti Zionism, the way it manifests itself today in the US, is experienced by Jews as a type of a direct attack on Jewish life, and it no longer has anything to do with Israel. You've asked, what did we learn in recent years? So, what we actually learned in recent years is that it disguises itself as a discussion on Israel, but it's not really about Israel. There isn't any actual discussion on Israel, no understanding of Israel. The arguments against Israel are so out there and far-fetched that it hasn't anything to do with Israel. We were in Spain and we were asked twice by journalists. They say that Israel is doing a Holocaust on Palestinians. What do you have to say about that? So it seems like a conversation about Israel. For many years, we mistook this as indeed that we need to hold a discussion on Israel, what Israel does, what Israel doesn't do, this government, that government. But actually, it's not a discussion about Israel. It's merely the guise for that, and in actual reality it's an onslaught, an attack on Jewish life in America. The types of anti-Semitism mentioned by Danny, you also have the Muslim kind, are less important in the sense that they do not exist in the places where Jews live in. If we're speaking about it from the intellectual identity perspective, most Jews in the US live in progressive circles. They are in the academia and universities, in the field of journalism. Those who are the elements of identification. I mean, the Jews used to consider themselves as part of these groups, those advocating human rights and anything that works for a better and more just society in the US. And now these are the circles who are saying to the Jews, you can no longer be a part of us if there is even an inkling of Zionism that clings to you. And we've seen how this has been exacerbated over the years. In the past, it used to be enough to say for a two-state solution, and that would have meant that people think that you're okay in left circles. Today, it's a joke. Today, Jews are required to be staunch anti-Zionist speakers. They should be the first ones to talk about apartheid and genocide and to head the Organization for Justice in Palestine. And then maybe they will be considered good enough Jews in order to be part of these organizations. And this is a very serious phenomenon. So I'll pick up on that and tell you from the young people I met, if we connect that to the progressive, I think it's like one way to be a Jew or a good Jew, and that's a Jew in my home. I'll be very, very cautious. They say to themselves, I won't identify to Israel. I'm definitely not a Zionist. It's even used as a curse on campuses, the word Zionist. And the places where I can express my Judaism in certain ways, I can say that even among those whom I worked with, they couldn't be the first contact people who will meet a student because they were Israelis and representing the Israeli government. And the first approach to a Jew shouldn't be by somebody who's represented as an Israeli. I think that this is something very dangerous, because if they can't be both Jews and Zionists, and anybody who reads the Bible knows that you cannot cancel the connection between Judaism and the land of Israel. What we have here is a very dangerous situation. I don't know if I would call it anti-Semitic, but I'm talking about hatred of Israel amongst Jewish circles, and it's no longer just something political. It's becoming something social, and how I perceive Israelis when I meet them. And the only thing almost that helped me is not just the organizations we're working with, but the personal encounter and the ability not to tell somebody that I'm Israeli. First, to allow the person to get to know me, and then maybe to reach a discussion that's a bit different. I'd like to talk about political disruption. Political disruption is not just in these areas between left and right, but also in the spheres of anti Semitism. I went to the Labor Committee in 2018 to talk against Corbyn and what was happening in the Labor. The progressive event isn't happening just in the US, it's all over the world because the more polarized we are, and that's what we see. Absolutely anti-Semitism. It's sad because the discourse is not normalized at all. Let's do a separation between these things. And Corbyn never ever assumed responsibility over anti-Semitism that was so prevalent in labor, and everything that Kurt Summer is doing, and he is doing a lot in order to uproot anti-Semitism from the Labor Party, didn't really help him. And we've seen the progressive side in the U.S. Re-elected once again in the Democratic Party with quite a majority. And Danny, my friend, he said, in the fairness that characterizes him as a public figure, he said ultimately this anti-Semitism hasn't taken its toll so far, but it's very dangerous because you say to yourself, who would have believed that the conservative government in Britain would be the most supportive government of the State of Israel in England? This is an event that we need to look at. Far from the US. In Jared, what we do, we started back in COVID. We understood that communities worldwide are not geared for emergency situations. I mean, the Jewish Agency helped with loans and distributing food baskets, things that you wouldn't imagine that in the US, Italy, Britain, and South Africa, they need help from the Jewish Agency. And over this past year, I've been in charge of a situation that we're leading in building resilience and combating anti-Semitism. And I'm getting out of the American sphere, and here I connect with Danny that Israel is too indifferent to what's happening in Jewish communities in Scandinavia. We see such rampant anti-Semitism that we see they're firing doctors from a hospital there, and Israel is not doing anything. Why were they being laid off? Four physicians were fired because of their Judaism, with great support of the communities both in Denmark and in Stockholm. They managed to triumph over this bureaucracy, the Swedish bureaucracy. And here, to a certain extent, it's hard for me to say, as somebody who lives this value of all Jews are responsible for each other. We stood and did nothing. Four different physicians were terminated, and the community had to deal, the Jewish community had to deal with it alone. And the community of Jews in Denmark, they're celebrating their 400 years in Denmark. They had a special event with the Queen there. And this event that's happening as we speak, we need to understand. And in this respect, the Jewish Agency, and we're doing things with WZO and with ADL, but they're doing everything, the Jewish Agency is doing everything it can to help people contend with anti-Semitism. Malmo is no longer a Swedish town. You need to understand that. It's no longer a Swedish town. You have the March of Kippot there, where Jews and non-Jews, the non-Jews who identify with the Jews, they march with them. Otherwise, they can't walk in the street with a kippah. Danny said that they pull a woman's wig or a head cover. It doesn't end at that moment. The trauma remains. Pittsburgh is, of course, an event that everybody brings up because it's so traumatic that from the Talia Lebanon, from the Israel Coalition of Trauma, had to go there in order to teach them how to establish resilience centers. But the entire event is much more important than the headline of this session. Let me ask you, Dr. Wilf, is it okay to hate Israel, to really hate it, and not be considered anti-Semitic? I mean, can one hate Israel and not be considered anti-Semitic? If the answer is no, there are countries in the world that are hated. Some people, for example, hate the country of Iran. I think you can understand that. Some people hate China because of Tibet. They really hate it. They boycott it. They hold campaigns against it. They say that you're not allowed, that the people shouldn't buy anything made in China. It's difficult nowadays, but people like Richard Gere do that. We're so focused on Israel, but there are entire populations populations in the world that loathe Syria of Bashar al-Assad. And, I could go on and on with this list. Is it okay? Can people be allowed to hate Israel without being considered anti-Semitic, or is every such thing considered anti-Semitism? And if it's all considered anti-Semitism, then shouldn't it actually be a diplomacy campaign? Look, I think that a lot of the phenomena that you're mentioning are quite marginal. No, these are not marginal. The resistance, the objection to Iran, to China, it was very popular in Hollywood in the 1990s. It's not something marginal. I have to say that the way I see it, there are diplomatic aspects as a grassroots movement, much less so. But the word or the term hatred in this respect or in this context is less relevant. The question is, what are people demanding? What are they saying? Why are they holding these campaigns? I mean, what for? What underlies all that? And here it took us a long time to understand the mistake, because we wanted to believe that these were campaigns about an end to the occupation because Israel is in the territories. This is why people are getting organized. This is why you have these boycott movements. Like you're saying, it's Tibet, or it has to do with the civil war in Syria. We wanted to believe that this was a similar case of a rational reaction to the actions of the state of Israel. And there's a way of thought that is very Zionist. And this is why it took me so long to accept this. The entire Zionist idea to think that we are masters of our own fate. And if we take a specific action, then the world's reaction will be different. Herzl believed that if we will establish a state of Israel, this will cure the world of its anti-Semitism. To understand this as anti-Semitism as something pathological that isn't related to whether Israel did something or didn't do something in the territories, that's something very saddening. But as time passes, we need to recognize that it had nothing to do with what the state of Israel did. Look, I understand your answer, and it adds so much to us. But I asked a simple question, and I'm a journalist. Us journalists, we're simple people. I asked, can people hate or boycott Israel without being anti-Semitic? Well, it depends for which purpose. Let's say somebody who objects to Israel's policy in Judea and Samaria. And this is usually their argument. They say, I hate, I loathe, it sullies my Jewish identity, I consider myself to be a progressive person. Danny heard a lot of people like that. It embarrasses me as a Jew. I loathe what you do. I want nothing to do with Israel. There are a lot of young American Jews who feel that. I mean, maybe they don't use the term hate or hatred, but they truly resent Israel. So such a person, whether or not he's a Jew, is he necessarily anti-Semitic? Once again, I'm sorry that this is my answer, but that's not the problem, because those Jews, what happened to those Jews, at the beginning we thought that it's a reaction to us. The thing is that they're under tremendous pressure to show that they hate Israel. So this is why they once said that it's because of the occupation, and then we said, okay, but we're trying to strike peace, and then we said it's not enough because you are a country that was born in sin and you have no right to exist. And see what's happening here is that this is not a debate, an argument about policy. They're not saying you should do something different, you need to change something. The entire concept of a Jewish state was born out of sin, and that idea is certainly anti-Semitic. Can I have kind of a smart alecky answer to that? Well, my instinctive answer to that is yes, you can hate Israel without being considered an anti-Semitic, but the probability of somebody hating Israel and not being anti-Semitic, that probability is lower. That's the event. If you look at what BDS is doing, and if you look at Jews. This week I was at the home of Ben Gurion, the chair of this house here in Tel Aviv, and Barbara and Carrie from Chicago, this couple came to visit. They were enjoying, and all of a sudden they got into a conversation with us about what they go through as Israel supporting Jews in America. And there's something right about what Einat is saying. The pressures from within the community, and it's mainly coming from the progressive areas. And like Danny said, nobody's been murdered yet, but this progression aggressiveness has a price, and it is taking its toll. So the probability of finding somebody who just spontaneously hates Israel, no, not spontaneously hating Israel, the probability that that person isn't carrying something that stems from anti-extremist, anti-Zionism, or anti-Semitism, the probability is not very high. Look at all the discussions, for example, in the UN about Israel, in the Human Rights Council, in the Security Council, in comparison to the amount of discussions on Syria. Look, you don't need to convince us. Yes, we're all familiar with the numbers. It was just in the context of Syria. Danny, I'd like to ask you, in respect to what Ayelet is saying and what Dr. Wilf said, you know, I'd like to pick up on what Ayelet said. She said if somebody doesn't like or hates or resents or whatever Israel, then probably there's a certain big loathing here of anti-Zionism. But in all the polls that I see among American Jews, Israel is not a top 5 priority. I don't remember if it was the recent poll, maybe the ADL's poll. It's not even in the next 5, and not even the 5 coming after. There are so many things that are important to American Jews, especially young American Jews, and also they don't like Israel. Not all of them, but many young liberal American Jews who identify as being such don't like Israel. I'd like to ask you, as somebody who experienced this evolution when you were general consul in New York, did you experience this evolution of the radical approach within the Democratic Party? I mean, to what extent is that related to the Jewish community? To what extent does it have anything to do with what the government of Israel does? Does it, and maybe it's related to the then government of Israel that communicated with only one party. That's at least what the Democrats at the time claimed. Look, it's not a zero-sum game. It's not either or. Of course, there are many elements that have an impact, but I think that the distinction made by Einat and Ayelet, which is a very important distinction, is between objection, and you even call it hatred. I'm willing to accept this expression, hatred towards Israel's policy, and hatred or objection to the right of the Jewish people to define itself. And one can object to Israel's policy to house demolitions. You can even protest. Oh, that's these applause were not for me, I guess. Oh, you can consider it as you've gained it. But when we're talking about objection to the right of the Jewish people's right of determination, yes, then that's anti-Semitism. I think there is no other expression for that. And of course, there are certain, you can look at the nuances. Is there a double standard or not? And we can rely on IRA's definition, which is very accurate and very smart. And this is why it's under attack right now. But let me say something else in this context regarding the word progressive. We are not going to change America. We cannot change America. What we could do, we can play and maneuver within the different circles or factions in American society. Progressiveness was not born out of Israel or the Palestinians. It's an outcome of much more profound processes, deeply rooted processes in the American society. So I suggest that we do not feel despair because of the progressives. What does that mean? Because with the progressives who don't like Israel, there's this expression, PBP. PBP, Progressive but Palestine, and there are quite a few of these, and perhaps the most prominent figure among them, I once introduced you to him, my dear friend Richie Torres, for a member of Congress, but not just him. I remember Bill de Blasio when I was in New York and he was the mayor. He would always say, I'm pro-Israeli because I'm progressive and not despite being a progressive, and he would provide arguments for that, including on the stage of AIPAC when others wouldn't agree to come. And this is a trend we must encourage. We must play on that field. The very prevalent attitude among quite a few Israelis, diplomats as well, is, you know what, let's stop everything. We're only going to look for friends among the evangelists. I think it's a disastrous approach. It's not a lost cause. It's not a lost struggle. It's not that we're going to win with a knockout, but we can make inroads into the progressive camp, and I think that's something we must do. But the prerequisite for our success, and I think this is the advice I tweeted to my friend Gilad Ardan. He was ambassador to Washington, if you remember. In addition to his position, that was quite odd that we had a part-time ambassador in Washington. But I said to him, you need to learn to speak the democratic language. Many Israelis don't really know how to speak that language, the language of the Democratic Party, the jargon of social justice, the jargon of race and gender and sexual orientation and so many other things. And let me just conclude with one more sentence. We are still stuck in our mindset with the Democratic Party of the 1980s or 90s, which was a quite conservative party with a hint of social justice. Today, the Democratic Party is more and more a social justice party. That's how they view it, and we won't change that. That's what at the center. All the rest is more marginal, and if we don't know how to speak this language, then this won't end up well for us. Shirley, I'd like to ask you about the experience of the campus itself, which you had experienced. To what extent do you feel that this is virtual sibling of those students? I'm talking about the non-Jews and their attitude towards Israel, Palestine. To what extent is it a matter of a social code, their wish to belong to a certain group? To what extent is it real? And it has to do with seeing Israel as part of the past, seeing Israel as part of some kind of a colonialist view, which is very valid in campuses. This is what they teach ideologically. And of course, it starts with the U.S. What is the true foundation of the U.S.? This idea that it was founded or born out of slavery, not out of its independence, the U.S. There's an ideological component that actually has nothing to do with us, but somehow it manages to include us. Look, I want to say, you talk about scholars, but what I came across is a lot of ignorance, complete lack of familiarity with Israel, the Israeli systems and Israelis, and often they don't even know Jews. A lot of the non-Jews I spoke with, they talked about Israel as a place where only Jews live. You know, whenever we started talking about Palestinians, they refer only to those who live outside of Israel borders, and that's already a mistake. And this is something that I would encounter every day. Specifically at Ohio University, there was a very active BDS cell, and I have to say that I was there for 3 years, and I could see how from one year to the next, their kind of talk was exacerbated. Let me give you an example. I remember in the first year, there was a BDS vote that a lot of Jewish students all of a sudden remembered that there's this place called Hillel, and perhaps it should be protected and defended out of the fear that they won't be able to walk safely in the campus. What the other side said was that Israelis are baby killers. I remember they even said that to me, and that there was a week I would check my car every day, burning Israeli flags on campus, cutting them up. And I remember, for example, this fair, and who leads these activities? Well, often we expect to see people with Palestinian roots, but ultimately what you meet is a very white person, very Caucasian, and they think that if they support BLM, that means they should be against Israel because the two can't go together. That's also the case within the Jewish community. If I want to be perceived as an enlightened person with social values, then I'm completely against Israel. But it doesn't stem out of a strong ideology, in my view. Sometimes it's from lack of knowledge and acquaintance. They've never met anything that has to do with Israel. They never met any Jews. And I have to say that within Christianity, we hear a lot about, old Christianity. Yes, I heard that from my students, but also when I met Jews who told me about the communities they come from, definitely Jews who grew up in areas where there aren't a lot of Jews. And I remember that in one of the flavor fairs with food from all over the world, it was very important for me to talk because all they showed in the Palestinian booth was about occupation. There was nothing that told the story of their people, and there was the Jewish fair, and a few Jews were happy to see Israeli flag, and that's wonderful, but also people spat on our pavilion, and they wouldn't allow me to even enter and speak. I couldn't speak with them or ask questions. Once it was clear that I'm Israeli, that was the end of the conversation. My students tried to go there. They agreed to have one of them, but it was quite impossible. And at the end of this event, this student passed by our desk, and I was there with two of my Jewish female students, and then he asked, "Is this Israel's flag?" And I said yes. And then he started yelling, "You're an apartheid state, and everything you do, and you're murderers." And we really wanted. I wasn't scared, I have to say, but my students, they took a few steps back. They were incapable of speaking. It really froze them. And so there was no option of actually talking. And then another student passed, and he said, "I saw this situation from this side. I don't know the story about Israel, but he's right." And that was the first year. Then the second year, there was already an apartheid wall, and this is all people heard about or saw about Israel. So I think what we need to do is to be proactive, not just to respond to what's happening. Okay, so that's exactly what I want to ask you before we finish. In order to try and be practical, what are the mistakes that Israel made or is still making in these contexts? I mean, obviously, we shouldn't accuse ourselves because of these manifestations of anti-Semitism, but Israel took upon itself the role of defending the Jewish people, and of course it does. And the question is, I mean, it's had a ministry of diaspora for many years because of coalition issues, and it invests a lot of money in it. The Jewish people invest a lot of money, maintaining the Jewish Agency and many other national institutions. So, academia, I mean, we are, between you and I, we are talking about the academia here. We're not talking about the restaurant business or the folk art business. We're talking about academia. This conversation is about academia and elites and progressive circles, because if I were to speak with Jews from Republican circles, they don't really feel progressive anti-Semitism. So in this respect, Jews always felt very free that this was their place, and this is why it's such a great shock. So I'd like to ask you, what did we miss, or what did we do wrong? And perhaps, and I'm bringing this up as well, maybe it's related to the fact that Israel started as a progressive project. This is how it was perceived, a social democratic process, and it was established by such people. Now it's changed. It's more conservative, more traditional, more religious. It's in the middle of this conflict, and this is why these circles are growing further and further away from him. Ben Gurion today, Nadav, would have been considered right-wing. I know that this is what the Likud says. I disagree with you. I beg to differ. As a journalist, it's fine to disagree with me. I haven't said that you're not allowed to disagree. I say that, Ben Gurion would be considered right-wing and Begin would be considered left-wing, because this is the disruption that happened in politics. Politics is no longer normal politics. It happened in the interface in this terrible arena of anti-Semitism, at least in my view, despite everything you've said about the Ministry of the Diaspora, which I think is very important. But what didn't happen was there wasn't any government resolution stating that the diaspora is important to us. This hasn't happened yet. We have a ministry, we're investing money, and I'm not sure that the amount of money that we think we're investing, I don't know if it's necessarily going to the right places. I'm also not sure that it's enough money. But if you walk down the street and ask a kid, we grew up with the mindset, you're younger than me, we grew up knowing that we have a family in the U.S. Not an actual family, but we have a family. There are people in America who belong to our people, who are part of us today. If you go to a school, to a neighborhood, to a street, they don't even know that there is such a thing as a Jewish people outside of Israel. This event, excuse excuse me for saying, Israel failed, in my view, with the decision that anybody who lives outside of Israel, even if it's not part of Israel's decision-making process, it's part of this people. If we're the Zionist project, well, the Zionist project also includes people. We're really focusing on the U.S., but I can also see what happens in tiny communities, Ecuador, with 700 Jews, in Iceland. You know, after COVID, all of a sudden, this community of 80 Jews became a community of 300 Jews, because there was such distress that some people that did not identify as Jews all of a sudden started identifying as Jews. And then Israel is doing something else. It separates from them, it disconnects from them, and it's saying to many of them, you're not Jews. That's also something Israel is doing. Not only do we not, why is Israel saying that to them? Because of conversion, because of the Kotel, because of these issues, which are very hot issues in the US. In other countries, it's less hot. What we see there is either Orthodox Jews or secular Jews. And ultimately, Israel is not taking the real important decisions. We expect Israel to be 15 or 16 million in several years. And part of it will be as a result of Aliyah, because it is going to happen when they come to Israel. What will we do with them? Also say that they're not Jews. I think there's a major mea culpa we need to take into account. In the U.S., we expect them to have birthright in the Jewish Agency, in the World Zionist Organization, with all of its educational frameworks. They're working so hard so that they know that they're Jews. But here we're not doing anything for Jews to know that there are Jews living outside of Israel, and this is something that must change. Let me start with this street perception I feel among me and my friends before Shlichut. Everybody who's a Jew loves us and is our best friend, and they're Jews just like us, but they just speak English or Spanish, and then we get there and discover a different world. And I don't think that the Israeli society and American society share the same values. They don't see eye to eye regarding values, and there isn't a sufficient effort, but it's even more than that, I think. No effort to see what's important to them and to respect them. And as a shaliach, when you leave, you're thinking about how can I create more socialization agents for Israel and make the students more loyal to Israel. Then you're missing the point. I can say to my students or any other partners, when they criticize us, you should tell them that you're wrong. But if you have criticism, you keep it to yourself. It doesn't work like that. I teach them, and I think it's very important to criticize, to critique Israel, but the problem is, where is it said, how it's said, and what goal does it seek to promote? And when we bring them here to birthright and tell them what an amazing place Israel is, and then when these young women go to pray at the Kotel and they throw bottles at them and spray water on them, then of course that ruins all of that. You know what? Let me stop you in order to say what you've just said and what Ayelet just said. It has nothing to do with the image. It has to do with what's Israel. The fact that it will distance this jury, that's obvious, but that's, and I say that I'm sorry, I regret this fact, this is Israel as well. We're talking about a cancellation of recognition of reform conversion all over the world as part of the coalition agreements. I don't know if it's going to happen, and we're not going to get into the politics of the new government, but what you've just demonstrated, it can't really be fixed. We need to fix the Israeli society in order to fix this. We'll soon get to you, Danny. What I'm trying to say is that ultimately, when this happens, it's going to be a severe blow. And I think that there is a certain gap in the set of values of the Israeli society and that of the American society. And I think that we're making a serious mistake here in not getting to know, but it's even more basic than that. It's picking up on what Ayelet said. As a history teacher, I look at the history books, and the diaspora, the story of the diaspora ends once the state of Israel is established. We don't learn about it. We don't know anything about it. There aren't any ties. I remember shlichim who would say they don't know who Herzl is, who Ben Gurion is, but what do we know about them? Who knows anything about them? I, of course, completely agree with everything that has to do with being in contact with the Jewish world and mutual acquaintance, and, of course, everything that has to do with liberalism within Israel and everything that needs to be done. in to this end. But in the specific context of anti-Zionism, this is something else. We connect it too much with other things, but it's something different. First of all, you talked about the history and how the state of Israel changed. If we need to know something in history and it's less well known, it's the huge contribution of the Soviet Union to turning anti-Zionism to a respectable academic discipline. The Russians and Soviets don't receive enough credit for their contribution to anti-Semitism. They wrote the main anti-Semitic book, and after World War II, they turned anti-Zionism into the key theme that they spread through Marxist circles in Europe. When you try to understand how come the left-wing parties in Europe become anti-Zionist as of the mid-1970s, it's all because of the Soviet Union. It's convenient for us to think that it's because of 67 and the occupation, but it's a very clear process, and that's actually the legacy of the Soviet Union to the global left, and this is why we see it in left-wing circles in the US. This talk about apartheid and racism, it's all there already. Today, they want to present it that Israel is called apartheid because of what it did in recent years. No, this has already been determined in the 70s and then gradually works its way into the left-wing circles. That's where it's at. So what we must do, we mustn't convince this subject with all the other subjects. We need to focus on it, to fight against it. And what the state of Israel needs to do here is not to weaken the Jews who are struggling. We too often give these Jews who are fighting we get them to feel, he said anti-Zionism is Zionism no longer exists, and of course Israel is terrible. Jews in the Labour Party have fought and toppled Corbyn. It was quite amazing. And as you know, British Jews don't like to be in the forefront of this struggle, but they did it because they understood that they were fighting about their ability to be Jews in Britain. And it wasn't about the occupation in Israel. AIPAC has changed in its entire format of work in America successfully in order to prevent Congress members who are committed to anti-Israeli positions to get to Congress. This is a real struggle, and we need to fight this with the tools of a battle, and Israel cannot. And here I'm leveling my criticism on the Israeli left circles who give the Jews in the U.S. too much the feeling that they're on the wrong side and there's no point in fighting. Ben Gurion and Begin were mentioned here earlier, so I'd like to say something or to start with the two of them. David Ben Gurion, to a great extent, rooted into the Israeli society, something that was perhaps necessary at the time. That's the negation of the diaspora. There was a need to teach the Israeli population, the Israelis, that they were pioneers and they're doing the right thing, and the Jews remaining on, in New Jersey and being well off, they were doing the wrong thing. Maybe back then it was necessary in order to build the Israeli society and the state of Israel, but today we are eating the rotten fruit, which is the outcome of this way of thinking. In August of 1948, Menachem Begin gave a speech in Jerusalem, West Jerusalem, of course, in one of the ceasefires in the 48 war, and he coined three slogans. One has become politically incorrect. He said the Jordan is not the border of our country, that is two banks to the Jordan River. The second one has been realized. He said that the wall of the old city is not the border of our capital. And the third one, which we forgot about, he said the sea is not the border, the boundary of our people. And now the sea has become the border of our people. I'd like to tell a story. I think I can tell the story today because he's retired from political life. Naftali Bennett visited me once in New York. He was a minister of something and a minister of the diaspora at the time, and I heard him say some things about American Jewry that were a cause for concern. I really didn't like hearing, and I think I know from whom he heard that. So we had a very long, very serious conversation about this, and I remember how decently enough, he called me from the airport on the way back to Israel, and he said, "You know what? I realized something after our conversation, Danny. I'm going to do this now and that." And then after a few months, we met once again in New York, and then he told me the following sentence. He said, "You know, you really helped me realize something," and I really started talking about the importance of the connection with the diaspora, and I completely agree with that. But whenever I talk about it, I lose a mandate. The Israelis are simply not interested in this. You talked about priority. Why losing a mandate? The fact that it's not interesting to the interviewer, but why lose a mandate to subsidize Jewish education in the U.S.? Are you crazy? I'm not going to vote for you if that's what you're going to do. I want to subsidize other things here in Israel. I see that we're about to finish, so I'd like to conclude and agree with what the other panelists have said here. We will not be able of entering the democratic circles that ultimately will gain a big part of government in the U.S. If we don't do that, we won't succeed. It's a prerequisite for us to take root in the progressive, the more moderate or less moderate progressive movements. The prerequisite for that is to be deeply rooted in American Jewry. And it is possible. Something Rabbi Shmuel Eliyahu said, it really surprised me. In one of the conferences of Makor Rishon, I think he said something, it's completely correct. I was surprised that he said that American Jews love Israel more than Israel loves American Jews. I The Haredim are something else, but in every synagogue, Reform, Orthodox, Conservative, there's always a flag of Israel. Maybe they just hung the flag because you came to visit. No, 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 that's not the case. You know what? I'll tell you two things very briefly. A while ago, there was a BLM demonstration in Kenosha, Wisconsin. And one of the protesters sprayed on a synagogue, Free Palestine. People said this is anti-Semitism. It's true that it's anti-Semitism, but why did he do that? Because the Reform synagogue in Kenosha, Wisconsin, they had an Israel flag hanging on the outside of the synagogue. So it's not, especially for me, that they hung the flag. And we earlier talked about Pittsburgh. I remember the Shabbat prayer a week after the murder in a different synagogue, of course, a Reform synagogue in Pittsburgh. Bougie also attended because he was the chairman of the Jewish Agency at the time. It was a very long prayer with speeches and songs and everything. And there were thousands of people, thousands of Jews who attended, and it ended with one national anthem, Hatikva. I don't know whether this was spontaneous or organized well organized. At the most important moment for that community, they ended with the national anthem, Hatikva. So they expect us to do so. All we need to do is actually do it. My dream is a party leader, instead of fighting over the Ministry of Defense, will say, I want the Ministry of the Diaspora. Okay, so with such a dream, which I don't think will be realized anytime soon, with such a dream, I believe we can conclude this panel, and I'd like to thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Nadav.